In this video, we're going to talk about two concepts. The first is the concept of an owned property, or the hasOwnProperty function. And the second concept is going to be about enumerating over properties in an object, or in other words, iterating or looping through the property names in an object. So what I have here is an example where I'm creating an object using the create method. And I'm having my object inherit from this parent, which is defined up here. And that's so that my object can get this full name property. And then I'll assign two new properties to my object, first name and last name. To help visualize this, I've created our two tables down below. And so this is our two objects, and this object here is the my object in table form, and this object up here is the my parent object. And you can see what's happening here is my object has two properties defined, first name and last name, and these are called own properties. In other words, they're defined directly on the object itself and not one of its ancestor prototypes. Then you can see that its prototype property points up to my parent, and there's another property there called full name. And so in this case, we would say that full name is an own property of the parent object, but not of the my object or the child. So let me show you in the console. I'll type my object so we can start to play around with it. Now, the reason that this distinction is important, why do we have this idea of an own property? Well, if I try to access the full name property on my object, keep in mind that my object is this child. I can still access the value, and that's because JavaScript looks up this prototype chain and finds the property somewhere further up in the chain, and then it returns its value, which in this case is just the function. But this property, full name, is not defined on my object, which is right here. It's this table here. It's defined further up the chain. So if we wanted to know whether or not full name is defined on the immediate object, in other words, does my object own this property, we can use a special function called hasOwnProperty. So I'll type my object, and then we'll say, we'll call the hasOwnProperty method and then pass in the name of the property as a parameter. And so what I want to know is, does my object own the property full name? And the answer is it doesn't. It's false. And that's because the full name property is defined on a different object. Let's see whether or not my object owns the first name property. The answer here is true, or yes, because the first name property is defined on the immediate my object. And the same goes for last name. So keep this principle in mind as we move on to the next subject, which is enumerating over properties of an object. The goal in this next part of the video is to loop over all of the properties inside of an object. And the reason we might want to do that is if we're copying one object to another. So to do that, we can use a for in loop. And then that control structure looks like this. We say for, and then I'll just create a variable, we'll just call it property. And we say for each property in an object, in this case the object will be my object. And what I'll do is just print out the property to the console. And let me set my filter here to show all the messages so that we can see. Now notice what this loop here did is printed out the property names, first name and last name, but then also printed out the property name in the parent, which is full name. Now usually this is not what we want, because we want to only show the properties that are on this particular object, typically if we're copying from one object to another. So what we can do instead of just printing out this property is check whether or not the property is defined on the immediate object that we're looping over. So to do that, I'll adjust this code just a little bit and put a check here that says if my object has this property, if it's an own property, then we'll print it to the console. And notice this time that only first name and last name gets printed. Now we can also get the value of the property, which would be a common thing to do if we're copying from one object to another. So why don't I print out the key, which is going to be the property key, and then we'll get its value using bracket notation and the variable name of the property. And to make this a little bit more clear, I'll put a colon in the middle. So to get some vocabulary straight, this control structure here is what it means to enumerate or loop over all of the keys in something, and in this case the keys are in the object. You might also say this is to iterate over the properties of an object. Now let's say we didn't want one of our properties to show up in this enumerable or this iteration. If you recall from the configuration of properties video, what we can do is to configure a property like this. So we can say object define property. In this case, we're going to do it on my object. And let's just configure last name. Now this property has already been defined. All we're going to do here is to configure it so that it's not enumerable. Keep your eyes trained over in the console. When I press save, notice now that the last name property is not showing up in our iteration here. And that's because I've configured it to be not enumerable. And if I get rid of this line and save again, notice now it comes back. Another way to get all the keys for the own object is to use the object keys function. And then pass the object as a parameter. I'll take these keys and just print them to the console so we can see. This will return an array of keys for the object, and it will automatically only return the keys that are associated with the immediate object. In this case, my object, and not any of its ancestors like my parent. And so when we call object.keys here, full name won't show up in that list. You can learn more about the hasOwnProperty function at MDN. And one quick note, when you look around source code in Meteor or other frameworks, you might notice that they use a helper in some cases using an underscore library, for example, or some one of their own helper functions for this. And that's because hasOwnProperty is not supported on all older browsers. But most of the modern browsers will support it, so I think it's pretty safe to use this function, hasOwnProperty. So in this video, we took a look at what it means for an object to have its own property versus one that's further up in the prototype chain. And then we looked at how to enumerate over properties of an object, or to look at its keys using the keys function.